Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. There are towns in England that seem to have made a private arrangement with time, in which time agrees to pass over them more slowly than it passes elsewhere, in exchange for nothing in particular except the town's continued willingness to remain exactly as it is. Rye, perched upon its small hill above the marshes of East Sussex, is such a town, and on a November evening in the year 1888, as the light fails over the River Rother and the tide draws back from the harbour, leaving the mudflats to gleam dull silver in the dusk, it is keeping faithfully to its part of the bargain. The cobbled streets climb steeply from the quay, worn smooth and treacherous by some 400 years of cartwheels and boot heels, and they wind among houses of timber and brick that lean toward one another overhead, as though exchanging some confidence too old and too settled to require the energy of a raised voice. Lights are coming on now in windows the size of a hand, candle by candle, lamp by lamp, the town arranging itself for the evening in the unhurried sequence it has followed since long before anyone now living can remember its beginning. Above it all stands the Church of St. Mary, its tower dark against a sky gone the colour of a healing bruise, and from the harbour below comes the low working sound of the sea, not loud, not threatening, simply present, the way breathing is present in a sleeping house. And halfway up the steepest and oldest of all the streets, where the cobbles climb in such a manner that a man with a cart must lean his whole weight into the pulling, a single window glows warm and amber against the gathering dark, and shows no sign, as the night deepens, of going out. The street is called Mermaid Street, and has been called so for longer than the oldest resident of Rye could account for with any certainty, the origin of the name lost somewhere in the town's smuggling centuries, when half its cellars connected to the others by passages built for purposes that respectable people did not inquire into too closely. The street rises from the bottom of the town in a long cobbled climb, lined on both sides with timber-framed houses whose upper stories overhang the lower in the old fashion, jettied out above the street until, in places, a person standing at an upstairs window might almost touch hands with a neighbour across the way. Halfway up, on the right hand going up, where the street levels briefly before its final steep pull toward the church, stands a building somewhat older and somewhat more crooked than its neighbours, its black timbers silvered with 4 centuries of weather, its small leaded windows uneven in their panes, in the particular way of very old glass, which has, over the long years, begun very slowly to flow downward, thickening at the base of each pane, as though the window itself were a creature of exceptional patience, conducting its own business at its own unhurried rate. Above the door hangs a sign, painted long ago and repainted more than once since, showing a kettle and a small brown wren perched upon its spout, and beneath the painted bird, in letters that have faded to the colour of weak tea, the Wren and Kettle. Below the sign in the window, a single oil lamp burns, and beside the lamp, propped against the glass, where any traveller upon the street might see it without need to come close, a small hand-lettered card reads, in a steady and unhurried script, "Open all night. None turned away." It has read so, this card, every night for 15 years. Inside, in the low-beamed front room of the tea house, where the ceiling presses close enough that a tall man must mind his head beneath the great oak beam that crosses it, a woman of past 60 years sits at a small table near the fire, mending a torn apron by the light of a single candle, her needle moving with the unhurried precision of someone for whom mending has long ceased to require the attention of the eyes and now occupies, instead, only the attention of the hands. Her name is Hester Allenby, and she has kept the Wren and Kettle, first alongside her husband, and these 15 years passed alone, for the whole of her adult life, since she came to Rye as a bride of 22 from a fishing family in Hastings along the coast, and found in this crooked old house, with its low beams and its uneven floors and its small windows looking out upon the steep cobbles of Mermaid Street, the only home she has ever properly wanted. She is a woman built along practical lines, not tall, not slight, with the steady solidity of someone who has spent 4 decades lifting kettles and carrying trays and standing for long hours upon stone floors, and who has found in this physical steadiness a kind of moral steadiness as well, the body's discipline becoming, over enough years, the discipline of the whole person. Her hair, once dark, is now a true and even grey, drawn back beneath a plain white cap. Her face is broad and weathered and deeply kind, with the particular kindness that has been worn into a face by long practice rather than natural disposition. The kindness, that is, of someone who decided once to be kind and has simply continued deciding it every day since. She wears a plain dark wool dress, much washed, and over it a white apron, and at her collar, pinned where another woman might wear a brooch, a small tarnished silver fishhook, bent now from age and from the years of her thumb passing over it in the unconscious manner of a worry bead. She does not look up from her mending as the door opens, because she has heard, in the particular creak of the third stair outside and the particular scrape of boots upon the step, that her first visitor of the evening has arrived, and the Wren and Kettle, as it has done every night for 15 years, prepares itself to receive him. Before the visitor, a word about the lamp in the window and about why it burns through every hour of every night in every season, regardless of weather or custom or the ordinary economy that governs most establishments of its kind. 15 years ago, in the November of 1873, Hester's husband, Samuel Allenby, a fisherman of this coast as his father had been before him, went out with 2 other men of Rye on a night that began calm and turned, with the particular treachery of the channel in late autumn, into something considerably less than calm before the boat could make safe harbour. A wave broke over the stern in the worst of it, and took Samuel with it into the black water. His 2 companions fought the boat back toward him as best the storm allowed, but lost sight and sound of him within minutes, and were forced, in the end, to save the boat and themselves, rather than continue a search the sea had already made hopeless. The 2 other men came home, cold and frightened, but whole. Samuel Allenby did not that night, in any case. He was found at first light upon the shingle below Camber, not far from shore. Close enough, the harbour master said afterward, that he must have fought his own way out of the water entirely, and might have walked the rest of the way himself, had there been any warmth, any light, any open door between the shingle and his own bed to draw him on through the last freezing mile of that night. There was not. The town was shut up tight against the cold, every window dark, every fire banked, every soul asleep in the perfectly reasonable conviction that there was no reason for any door to stand open at 3 o'clock on a November morning. He died, the doctor said afterward, not of the sea, but of the cold that came after it. A cold he might have survived, with warmth and rest, had any such thing been available to him in those last hours. Hester Allenby buried her husband in the churchyard of St. Mary, on the hill above the town he had loved, and she did not, in the weeks that followed, rage against the sea, which had only done what the sea has always done, nor against the town, which had only slept as towns are meant to sleep. She did something else instead. She decided, with the quiet and absolute decisiveness that has characterized every important choice of her life, that the Wren and Kettle would never again be a house that closed its door against a cold and frightened soul in the dark hours of the night. That whoever came, sailor or traveller, doctor or drunkard, the lost and the grieving and the merely sleepless, would find at this address upon Mermaid Street a fire that had not gone out, and a kettle that was never quite empty, and a door that opened from the inside before the knock upon it had fully finished sounding. She has kept that promise every single night since. The front room of the Wren and Kettle is small, perhaps 4 paces by 5, but it has been arranged over 15 years of nightly use with the particular economy of a space that must serve many purposes and serve them all well. Along the back wall stands the great black iron range, never cold, upon which 2 kettles sit perpetually at the ready, one simmering gently for immediate use, the other standing further back, warming slowly against the moment when the first runs dry. Beside the range, a dresser of dark old oak holds the cups, none of them matching, each acquired across 15 years from markets and gifts and the occasional kindness of a grateful traveller, so that a visitor might be served from a cup painted with roses, or a cup commemorating some long-forgotten jubilee, or a plain cup of brown earthenware worn smooth by handling. According to no system Hester has ever troubled to explain beyond the private logic of which cup, on which night, seems to suit which face. A row of canisters along the dresser's upper shelf holds her teas, the everyday black blend she serves to most who come, made up to her own recipe from leaves bought in bulk from a merchant in Hastings. A gentler chamomile for the anxious and the unwell. A dark, bracing brew she keeps for the men who come in off the boats, half frozen, needing something with iron enough in its taste to convince the body that warmth is truly returning. Beside the canisters, a small clock kept 5 minutes fast, a habit Samuel began and Hester has never seen fit to correct, ticks its way through the long hours. 3 small tables, each seating 2 or 3, are scattered about the low-beamed room, each with its own chair or stool, none of them matching the others any more than the cups do. The largest of these stands nearest the fire, and it is here, more often than anywhere else, that Hester's visitors find themselves seated, drawn by the particular gravity that a good fire exerts upon a cold and tired person, regardless of the hour or the century. Above the mantel hangs a small framed photograph, rare and costly enough 15 years ago that few in Rye possessed such a thing, showing a broad-shouldered young man in his fishing jersey, squinting against the sun that has long since set, his arm around a young woman who is unmistakably, though scarcely recognizable across the gulf of 40 years, Hester herself. At 6:30, each evening, as the light veils properly over the marshes and the last of the day's ordinary custom, the fishermen's wives in for their gossip, the carters stopping for something warm before the final leg home, has drifted away into the dusk, Hester Allenby performs the small sequence of tasks by which the Wren and Kettle transforms itself each night from an ordinary tea house into the particular institution it has become. She banks the fire properly, not for the night. The fire of the Wren and Kettle is never banked for the night, not truly, not in 15 years, but for the long stretch of quiet hours that generally follow the dinner trade and precede whatever the small hours may bring. She fills both kettles fresh from the pump in the yard behind, the water cold and sweet from the well that has served this house since long before Hester's time. She trims the wick of the lamp in the window and refills its oil and sets it burning at the particular steady brightness that can be seen on a clear night from halfway down the hill toward the harbour, where a man coming up from the boats might first catch sight of it and feel whatever else the night had brought him, the particular relief of knowing that somewhere ahead of him a door stood open. She checks the small hand-lettered card in the window. Open all night, none turned away, though it requires no checking, since it has not moved from its place in 15 years. But the checking has become a part of the ritual, nonetheless, a small private confirmation that the promise still stands, and she sits down at the small table nearest the fire, with whatever mending or small work the evening offers, and she waits, not impatiently, not with any particular expectation, but with the settled readiness of a woman whose whole life has organized itself around the simple fact that someone, eventually, on any given night, will need exactly what she has to offer, and that the offering of it is no longer a choice. She makes fresh each evening, but has become, over 15 years, something closer to her own nature. Tonight, as on every night, the lamp burns steady in the window. Tonight, as on every night, the door is not locked. It comes at 7 o'clock precisely by the clock that runs 5 minutes fast, which places it by the true hour at 5 minutes to 7. A distinction Hester has long since stopped troubling to make, since the clock's small error has become, over the years, simply another fact about the room, no more remarkable than the particular creak of the third stair or the way the fire always wants coaxing on a south wind. It is not this first knock, the knock of someone uncertain whether they are welcome. It is brisk and businesslike, 3 solid raps delivered by a gloved fist, the knock of a man who has knocked upon this particular door at this particular hour many times before, and expects, with entire confidence, to find it opened. "Come in, then, Mr. Tutt," Hester calls, without rising, for she has heard the particular jingle of harness bells in the street outside that announces, as reliably as any clock, the arrival of the 7 o'clock carrier's cart returning from its round of the marsh hamlets, and with it, its driver. The door opens on a blast of cold November air, and the figure of a large man, perhaps 50 years of age, swathed in a heavy driving coat, whitened at the shoulders, with a fine mist that has begun in the last half hour to settle over the marshes. He is Josiah Tutt, who has driven the marsh roads out of Rye for the better part of 30 years, through every weather the Channel coast can produce, and who has stopped at the Wren and Kettle on his way to put up his cart at the Mermaid stables these past dozen years and more, ever since the night. He does not speak of it often, but Hester knows the story, as she knows most stories that pass along this particular stretch of road, when a bad fall of snow nearly cost him the road entirely, and the lamp in this window was the only mark by which he found his way at last into the shelter of the town. "Evening, Mrs. Allenby," he says, stamping the wet from his boots upon the worn stone of the threshold. "Bitter work tonight. The horses don't care for the fog coming up off the marsh." "Sit by the fire," she says, already reaching for the dark, bracing blend she keeps for exactly such occasions. "I'll have something hot in your hand before you've your coat half off." He settles into the chair nearest the fire with the particular groan of a large man lowering himself after some hours upon a hard coach box, and stretches his booted feet toward the flames with evident relief, while Hester busies herself at the range, warming the dark blend in the pot that has, over a dozen years of this same ritual, come to be known between them, without either having ever formally named it so, as Mr. Tutt's pot. "How is the road?" she asks, though she knows already, in the general way, what the answer will be, the marsh roads being, in November, a fairly reliable provider of cold, mud, and slow going, with variations only in degree. "Slow," he confirms, "fog coming up thick out by Iden Lock, where the canal road bends, thick enough I'd not have trusted my own eyes if I hadn't the road by heart these 30 years. Lost old Brewer for a full minute past the turning. Thought the fog had taken him entire, until I heard him sneeze, the great fool, and knew where to look." He accepts the cup she brings him with both hands, the steam rising into his weathered face. "There's talk of a line built clear across the marsh one day, which would put me and my cart out of work entire, I shouldn't wonder." "It would change a great deal," Hester agrees, settling into the chair opposite with her own cup of the everyday blend. "Quicker isn't everything," Tutt says, with the particular gruffness of a man defending something he knows, on some level, may someday be lost. A train doesn't know the road, doesn't know where the bad ground is past the lock, where a horse is apt to need slowing for, fog or no fog, doesn't stop for a fellow waving from a gate with a sick child, needing the doctor fetched faster than the regular round allows. "I've done that a dozen times in 30 years, Mrs. Allenby, and no train will ever do it once." "No," she says, "I don't suppose it will." There is a companionable silence then, of the kind that exists between two people who have shared this particular fire on this particular hour many dozens of times, and require no especial effort to fill the space between them with conversation, the silence itself being, by now, almost as comfortable as the talk. Tutt drinks the first cup quickly, the way a cold man does, more for the warmth of it against his hands and throat than for any savouring of the taste, and Hester is up and refilling it before he has properly set the empty cup down, this too being part of a ritual so worn smooth by repetition that neither party troubles any longer to remark upon it. "You'll be wanting to know," he says, accepting the second cup with rather more leisure than the first, "that I saw young Williams on the road tonight, walking out toward Iden, alone, in this weather, no coat to speak of. I'd have stopped for him, but he waved me on, said he'd rather walk." Hester's hand still for a moment upon her own cup. "Walking to Iden in November with no coat. That's what I saw." Tut's broad face creases with the particular concern of a man who has spent 30 years upon the roads of this district and has learned, in that time, to read trouble in the smallest signs. A too quick wave, a face turned too determinedly away, a pace too fast for any sensible errand on a night like this one. He's not been himself, by what I hear, since the business with the Coombe girl. Her family put a stop to it, I'm told, on account of his prospects not being what they'd hoped, and he's taken it hard. I had heard something of it, Hester says quietly. She is silent a moment, looking into the fire, and Tut, who has known her long enough to recognize the particular quality of her silences, does not interrupt it. "If he comes this way," she says at last, "he'll find the door open, same as you did that night in the snow." "I know it," Tut says, and there is something in the simple certainty of his answer, the easy, unquestioning confidence that of course she will be there. Of course the lamp will be burning. Of course, whatever trouble walks up Mermaid Street tonight will find this particular door standing ready. That says, more clearly than any direct compliment could, exactly what 15 years of an open door have built in this small corner of Rye. The second cup finished, Tut rises with the particular reluctance of a warm man facing a cold yard, settling his driving coat back across his broad shoulders and turning up its collar against the night still waiting outside. "What's owed, Mrs. Allenby?" he asks, as he asks every night, reaching for the coins in his waistcoat pocket. "What's always owed, Mr. Tut?" she answers, as she answers every night, which is to say a price so modest as to be almost nominal. Enough, she has always maintained, to preserve the dignity of the transaction on both sides, not enough to ever stand between a tired traveller and a hot cup on a cold night. He pays her and pauses a moment at the door, his hand upon the latch, looking back at the small warm room with its fire and its mismatched cups, and the woman who keeps it. 15 years now, isn't it? He says. Not quite a question, more a kind of accounting, the sort a man does sometimes without entirely meaning to, simply because the number has occurred to him and seems worth saying aloud. 15 years this past August, Hester confirms. Samuel would be proud of you, Tut says, with the particular gruff directness of a plain man venturing into sentiment he is not entirely comfortable with, but has decided, on this occasion, is worth the discomfort. I knew him a little, you know. Good man. Steady. He was, Hester says, and there is no grief in it now, after 15 years, only the plain and settled fact of a man who was good and steady, and is, in this particular and ongoing way, still keeping his promise to the road even now, through the medium of the wife who carries it forward in his stead. Tut nods, as though something has been satisfactorily confirmed, and steps out into the fog and the dark and the long remaining miles toward the marsh, the door closing behind him on a final gust of cold November air, and the lamp in the window burning on, undisturbed, into the deepening night. For the better part of an hour after Tut's departure, the Wren and Kettle stands empty of visitors, and Hester occupies the interval as she occupies most such intervals, not idly, for idleness has never come easily to her, but with the small, steady tasks that keep a house of this kind ready for whatever the night might yet require. She refills the kettles. She checks the level of oil in the lamp, though she filled it not 2 hours before and knows perfectly well it does not yet require attention. The checking has become, like so much else in her evening, less a practical necessity than a kind of devotion, performed for its own sake rather than for any strict usefulness. She takes down the everyday blend and measures a fresh quantity into the canister from the larger store kept in the back room, restocking against the hours still to come. Outside, the fog has thickened further, rolling up from the marshes in the particular way it does on still November nights, when the warmth of the day's last hours rises from the wet ground and meets the falling cold of evening, and a rye finds itself, for some hours, wrapped in a silence so complete that even the gulls have ceased their evening cry, and the only sound to be heard upon Mermaid Street is the occasional drip of moisture from the overhanging eaves of the old houses falling onto cobbles already slick and silvered with damp. Hester sits at her table near the fire and takes up her mending again. The same torn apron from earlier, its tear now nearly closed beneath her steady needle, and thinks, as she often does in these quiet hours, of Samuel, not with the sharp grief of the early years, but with the settled companionship of someone long familiar, a presence felt rather than mourned, as constant in its way as the fire itself. She does not know, as the clock that runs 5 minutes fast ticks toward 8, who the fog will bring her next. She has learned, across 15 years, simply to wait, and to trust that whoever comes will come for a reason, and that the room is ready to receive them. The second knock of the evening comes at 20 minutes past 8, and it is a different knock entirely from Tut's brisk confidence, quieter, almost apologetic, the knock of a man too tired to put much force behind his fist, but too cold and too far from his own bed to pass the lamp in the window without stopping. "Come in," Hester calls, already rising, for she recognizes this particular weary knock as surely as she recognized the harness bells before it. The door opens upon Dr. Edmund Fenwick, the younger of the 2 physicians who serve Rye and the scattered farms of the surrounding marsh, a man of perhaps 35, with the particular grey pallor of someone who has been many hours without proper rest, and has, in those hours, witnessed something that has taken a toll beyond the merely physical. His black bag hangs heavy from one hand. His coat, when he removes it, is damp through at the shoulders and crusted with mud to well above the knee. "Dr. Fenwick," Hester says, taking his coat without being asked, for this too is a ritual long established between them. "You've come from the marsh, by the state of you." "Snargate," he confirms, sinking into the chair by the fire with the particular collapse of a man who has been holding himself upright by will alone for some hours past the point his body would have preferred to stop. "A birthing, twins, and a difficult one. I've been at it since 4 this afternoon. And the mother will live, God willing, and so will both the children. though it was a near thing with the second. He passes a hand over his face, and for a moment, the careful professional composure that doctors learn to maintain slips, showing beneath it the simple human exhaustion of a man who has spent the last 4 hours fighting with everything his training and his hands could offer against the possibility of a very different outcome. I don't know that I have ever been so frightened in my professional life, Mrs. Allenby, and I have delivered breech births and set compound fractures and sat with men dying of fevers no medicine of mine could touch. But there is something particular about the fear of losing 2 lives at once, when both are so very small. Hester says nothing to this directly, but moves to the range and begins, without being asked, to prepare the gentler chamomile blend she keeps for exactly such occasions as this. She brings him the tea and a slice of the bread and butter she keeps always ready for visitors, too tired or too distracted to think of having eaten properly, and sets both before him without comment, knowing from long experience that Dr. Fenwick, like most men who carry the particular weight of his profession, requires a few minutes of simple physical comfort before he is ready to speak further of what has brought him to her door. He eats and drinks in silence for some minutes, and Hester occupies herself with small tasks nearby, never far, never pressing, but present in the particular way that allows a tired person to feel accompanied without feeling observed. They are calling the boy Samuel, Fenwick says at last, into the quiet. The mother told me so, not an hour past, before I left. She did not know, I think, that the name held any particular significance in this town, but I confess it struck me rather forcibly, coming as it did at the end of a night when I had spent some hours uncertain whether either child would live to be named at all. Hester's needle pauses, briefly, over the work she has taken up again. Samuel is a common enough name on this coast, she says gently, among fishing families especially. There's no shortage of reasons a mother on the marsh might choose it that have nothing at all to do with mine. No, Fenwick agrees, but I thought of him nonetheless. Your husband, I mean. I never knew him, of course. I was scarcely out of my studies when he died, but I have heard the story, as everyone in this town has heard it, and I confess that tonight, driving back from Snargate in the fog with 2 new lives in the world that very nearly were not, I found myself thinking that there is a particular symmetry in it. A man lost to the cold because no door stood open, a door that has stood open every night since, in his memory. And tonight, a small new life carrying his name into a generation he will never see, in a house he will never visit, simply because his name was, on this stretch of coast, a good name, a name a mother might reach for without quite knowing why. He looks up at her, and there is something in his tired eyes, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of having ventured into territory that is properly hers and not his to claim. And Hester, after a moment, smiles, the particular soft smile of a woman receiving an unexpected gift she had not thought to ask for. Thank you for telling me, she says simply. I shall think of him kindly, the small Samuel of Snargate, whenever I think of mine. While Fenwick eats and rests, the fog beyond the small leaded windows has thickened still further, rolling up Mermaid Street in slow grey coils that catch and hold the light from the window in a soft, luminous haze, so that the lamp, viewed from the street, seems to burn within a sphere of its own gentle radiance, distinct from the ordinary dark around it. It is the particular fog of the Romney Marsh in November, thick, damp, and curiously silent, swallowing sound as thoroughly as it swallows sight, so that a man walking the cobbles outside might pass within a few feet of the tea-house's door and never know it was there at all, were it not for the small persistent glow of the lamp, burning on through the murk with the patient stubbornness of something that has learned, over many years, not to depend upon being noticed in order to continue its work. Fenwick, following Hester's gaze toward the window, gives a small, tired laugh. I very nearly missed the turning myself, coming up from the quay. If I had not known the street by years of habit, I think I might have walked straight past your door and on toward the church before I realized my error. He pauses. It occurs to me, Mrs. Allenby, that there must be a great many nights when your lamp burns for hours together and no one comes at all. Does it not trouble you, the keeping of it, on such nights? Hester considers this with the particular seriousness she brings to questions that touch, even obliquely, upon the central purpose of her life's work. No, she says at last, or not in the way you mean. A lighthouse does not trouble itself over the ships that pass safely by without ever needing its light. It is enough, I think, that the light is there to be seen, should anyone need it. The nights no one comes are not wasted nights. They are simply nights when no one needed me, which is its own kind of good fortune, even if it makes for quiet company. Fenwick is silent a moment, considering this, his tea cooling somewhat forgotten in his hands. That is a more generous philosophy than most men manage, in my experience, he says at last. Most of us require to be needed rather more visibly than that. Most of us are not keeping a promise to someone we loved, Hester says simply, and returns to her mending. By the time Fenwick has finished his tea and his bread, and the colour has returned somewhat to his tired face, the clock on the dresser shows 9:30, by its own 5 minutes fast reckoning, and the doctor rises with the particular stiffness of a man whose body has only now begun to register the full account of the day's exertions. I am grateful, Mrs. Allenby, as I am always grateful, he says, retrieving his coat, still damp but somewhat warmed now from its hour by the fire. I do not know how many of my patients in this district owe some small measure of their recovery to the fact that their physician was able to stop here, on the worst of his rounds, and find an hour's warmth and rest before continuing on. I suspect the number is larger than either of us could properly account for. You give me too much credit, Hester says, though not without a certain quiet pleasure in the saying of it. I only keep the kettle on. You keep a good deal more than the kettle on, Fenwick says, with the particular directness of a tired man who has set aside, for the moment, the usual reticence of polite conversation. But I will not embarrass you further by insisting upon it. He pays her, slightly more than she would ask, as he always does, a small private correction to her deliberately modest pricing that she has long since stopped troubling to argue against, recognizing it as his own way of expressing a gratitude that plain words do not quite satisfy. Good night, Mrs. Allenby. I hope your evening continues quieter than mine has been. Good night, Dr. Fenwick. Give my good wishes to the mother of Snargate when next you call upon her. And to her small Samuel, he smiles, the first proper smile she has seen from him all evening, and steps out into the fog, which closes around him within 3 paces, swallowing the sound of his footsteps almost at once, so that within moments it is as though he had never been there at all, except for the lingering warmth in the chair by the fire and the empty cup upon the table, and the particular quality of fullness that the room retains for some minutes after, of having recently held a grateful presence within it. The clock that runs 5 minutes fast strikes 10, which is to say 5 and 50 minutes past 9, by the true and ungenerous reckoning of the world outside Hester's small kingdom, and finds her alone again, the fire built up fresh against the deepening cold of the night, the fog beyond the windows now so thick that the street lamp at the corner of Mermaid Street and the High Street, ordinarily visible as a faint orange smudge through the gloom, has vanished entirely, leaving the Wren and Kettle's own lamp as the only point of light visible from any distance along the whole steep climb of the street. This is, Hester has come to understand, across 15 years of such nights, the hour at which the character of her custom tends to change. The early evening brings the practical visitors, the carriers, the tradesmen finishing late rounds, the occasional fisherman's wife stopping for company on her way home from some errand. But as 10 o'clock gives way to 11, and 11 toward the deep, small hours that most respectable households have long since surrendered to sleep, the visitors who find their way to her door begin to carry a different quality of need, not merely cold or tired, but troubled in some manner that the ordinary daylight hours of the town do not provide adequate space to address. She has learned to recognize the signs of this shift in the quality of the night itself, a particular deepening of the silence outside, a particular settling of the fire into its steadier, more patient burning, a particular alertness that comes over her own attention, as though some part of her, honed by 15 years of practice, has begun listening for footsteps upon the cobbles with rather more care than the earlier hours required. She refills her own cup, the everyday blend taken plain as she has always preferred it, and settles back into her chair and waits with the particular patience of a woman who has long since made her peace with waiting as one of the central disciplines of her chosen life, for whatever the deepening fog might yet bring up Mermaid Street toward her open door. It is past 11 when the third visitor of the evening arrives, and there is no knock at all, only the long creak of the door's old hinge, opening slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the hand upon the latch were uncertain, even at this late stage, whether to proceed. Hester looks up to find a young man of perhaps 22, standing in the doorway, his coat, what little coat he wears, a thin thing entirely inadequate to the November fog, soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale with cold, and with something beyond cold that Hester recognizes at once, having seen its particular quality many times before in 15 years of late visitors. It is Thomas Williams, the young man of whom Josiah Tutts spoke some hours before, walking out toward Iden without a proper coat, refusing the offer of a ride. He has evidently been walking still these past hours, through fog and damp and the gathering cold, in the particular restless manner of a young man trying to walk his way out of a grief too large for any reasonable distance to contain. "Mr. Williams," Hester says, rising at once, her voice carrying none of the alarm she feels at his condition, for she has learned, across many such evenings, that alarm in her own voice does more harm than good to a person already at the edge of some private crisis. "Come in out of the wet. Sit by the fire." He does not move at first, standing in the doorway with the fog curling in around his thin shoulders, his eyes, when they finally meet hers, carrying the particular bewildered quality of someone who has wandered, without entirely meaning to, into a place of warmth and is not yet certain he has any right to claim it. "I didn't mean to come here," he says, his voice rough with cold and with something that might be the beginning of tears held back by considerable effort. "I was only walking. I didn't notice where my feet had taken me until I saw the lamp." "That is precisely what the lamp is for," Hester says gently, and takes him by the arm, for he sways slightly, the cold and the exhaustion of some hours' aimless walking finally catching up with him, now that warmth and shelter have given his body permission to register its own depletion, and guides him toward the chair by the fire, the same chair that held Tut and Fenwick before him, worn warm now by the long evening succession of troubled travellers finding their way to its particular comfort. She does not press him for explanation, not yet, but moves at once to the practical business of warming a young man who has clearly been some hours in the wet and cold without adequate protection against either. She brings a blanket from the chest beside the dresser, kept always ready for exactly this purpose, and wraps it about his shoulders over his sodden coat, and presses a cup of the dark, bracing blend into his cold, stiffened hands, closing his fingers around it with her own warmer ones when he seems too dazed to manage the simple task himself. "Drink that," she says, in the tone she might use to a child, gentle but entirely without room for argument. "Small sips, mind, until you've warmed through properly. There's no hurry in this room, none at all." He obeys, his hands shaking slightly as he raises the cup, and for some minutes neither of them speaks, Hester occupying herself with building the fire higher and fetching dry stockings from the same ready chest, Samuel's own, kept these 15 years for exactly such emergencies, the supplies slowly diminishing over the decades, but never quite exhausted, while Thomas Williams sits wrapped in his blanket, drinking his tea in small, obedient sips, the colour returning slowly to his face as the worst of the cold's grip eases. "Better?" Hester asks at last, when his hands have steadied and his shivering has largely subsided. "Better," he confirms, though his voice still carries the particular flatness of someone for whom physical warmth has done nothing to touch the deeper cold underneath it. "I'm sorry to have troubled you, Mrs. Allenby. I should not have come at such an hour. I should not, perhaps, have come at all." "You are no trouble whatsoever," Hester says, settling into the chair opposite him with her own cup, her voice carrying the particular calm authority of someone entirely certain of her ground. "This door has been open every night for 15 years, precisely so that a young man walking the roads in November without a proper coat might have somewhere to come to. You have done exactly what the lamp in my window is for. Now, when you are ready, and not one moment before, you might tell me what has put you upon the Iden road tonight, in such weather, in such a state, or you might not. The tea is the same either way. He is silent for a long moment, staring into the fire with the particular fixed attention of someone working up the courage to speak something he has perhaps not yet said aloud to any living soul. And Hester waits, her needle moving once more over the apron she has been mending all evening, her attention present but not pressing, offering him the particular gift of a silence he is free to fill or not fill, exactly as he chooses. "You'll have heard, I expect," he says finally, "about Susanna Combe." "I have heard a little," Hester acknowledges, "that her family did not approve the match." "They did not approve me," he corrects, with a bitterness that suggests the distinction matters to him a great deal. "My prospects," her father says. "I am a clerk at the solicitor's, Mrs. Allenby. A good position, a respectable one, with every reasonable expectation of advancement in time. But her father has set his sights on something grander for her, a young man from Hastings with property already settled on him, who can offer her this very year what I might only promise her in some uncertain future. And Susanna," his voice catches and he stops and drinks from his cup and tries again. "Susanna will not defy him. I do not blame her for it. He is her father, and she loves him, and I think she loves the comfort and certainty he can offer her too, more than I had let myself believe. We are not to see each other again. It was decided 3 days ago, and I have not known what to do with myself since." "And so you walk," Hester says gently, "in the fog, without a coat, toward Iden, where I do not suppose you have any particular business at all." "I don't," he admits, and there is something almost like a laugh in it, though it carries no humor. "I haven't, these 3 days. I walk because sitting still seems unbearable, and because walking, at least, gives the misery somewhere to go, besides simply sitting in my chest like a stone. I had not meant to come this far tonight. I had not meant anything at all, I think, except to keep moving until I was too tired to feel it so sharply." Hester sets down her mending entirely now and looks at him with the full and undivided attention she reserves for the moments when a visitor's trouble has finally found its way, however haltingly, into words. "That is a very natural thing to do in grief," she says. "I did something similar myself 15 years ago, though my walking took a rather different and more permanent form. But Mr. Williams, and I say this to you as someone who has had a great deal of time to consider the matter, a body cannot walk itself clear of grief. It can only walk itself tired, which is not at all the same thing, however much it may feel so in the moment." She tells him then, briefly and without dwelling over long upon the particulars, the story of Samuel. Not as a tale she repeats often, for she does not, but as a gift offered specifically and deliberately to a young man who needs just now the evidence that grief of this magnitude can be survived, and survived into something that still resembles a life worth living. "I did not walk the roads as you have done tonight," she says. "I kept this house instead, every night, exactly as Samuel and I had always kept it, because I found I could not bear the alternative, could not bear to let his death close a door that he, of all men, would have wanted kept open. For the first year, I will tell you honestly, I do not think I felt very much of anything beyond the keeping of it. I made the tea and tended the fire and greeted whoever came to the door, and some part of me understood, even then, that I was doing useful work, but I did not feel it, particularly as comfort. It was simply the only structure I had left to hold myself upright within. And then, Thomas asks, his eyes fixed upon her now with the particular intensity of someone listening for evidence that his own current darkness might eventually give way to something else. And then, slowly, I could not tell you the precise month it happened, for it was not a single moment, but a long, gradual turning, like a tide changing. I began to notice that the keeping of the house had become itself a kind of company, that the people who came through that door, night after night, each carrying their own particular trouble, had given me something I had not expected to find again, the sense of being needed, of being useful to the world in a manner that did not require Samuel's presence to make it meaningful. I did not stop missing him. I do not think I will ever stop missing him, not entirely. But I found, eventually, that missing him and living a full life were not, after all, in opposition to one another, as I had rather assumed they must be in those first terrible months. Thomas is quiet for a long moment, considering this. I cannot imagine, just now, ever feeling anything but this, he says at last, very low. No, Hester agrees. I don't suppose you can. Grief never permits that particular imagination in its early hours. But I will tell you what I have learned. In 15 years of watching a great many people pass through this door in states not unlike yours, the feeling that this darkness is permanent is itself one of the most reliable symptoms of grief and one of the least reliable predictions of what is actually to come. They sit together for some while after this, not speaking a great deal more, but sharing the particular companionable quiet of two people who have, between them, said something true and do not feel the need to immediately crowd it with further words. The fire burns steady. The fog presses close against the small leaded windows. Thomas Williams's cup, refilled once more without his having to ask, cools slowly in his hands as the worst of his agitation settles, gradually, into something closer to simple, exhausted sadness, still painful, but no longer carrying the frantic edge that drove him out into the November night without a coat. Will you walk on to Iden tonight? Hester asks eventually. Or might I persuade you toward your own bed instead? He considers this with the first flicker of something like wry self-awareness he has shown all evening. I don't think I had any real business in Iden at all, he admits. I don't believe I was walking toward anywhere in particular, only away. Then might I suggest, Hester says, that a way has served its purpose for tonight, and that your own bed, dry and warm, would serve you rather better than the Iden road in this fog. You will not feel less sad for sleeping, but you may find you feel rather more capable of carrying the sadness once the body has had its proper rest. He nods slowly and begins, with rather more steadiness than he showed upon arrival, to unwrap the blanket from his shoulders. Thank you, Mrs. Allenby, he says. I don't know that I would have made it home at all in this fog without having stopped here. I might simply have walked until I dropped, and no one the wiser until morning. That is precisely why the lamp is lit, Hester says simply, helping him into his still damp coat, now somewhat warmed by its hours before the fire. Come back, if you find you need to. The door does not keep particular hours for particular sorrows. It is open for whatever finds its way to it. He pauses at the threshold, the fog waiting beyond it, and looks back at her with an expression that carries beneath its lingering sadness something that might, in time, become gratitude, properly settled. "I think I begin to understand," he says, "why Mr. Tutt speaks of this house the way he does." And then he is gone, swallowed by the fog within 3 steps, leaving Hester alone once more with the fire and the lamp and the particular satisfaction, quiet, undramatic, but real, of having done, on this night, as on so many nights before it, exactly the work she rose each evening to do. The clock that runs 5 minutes fast strikes midnight, 11:55, properly, and from somewhere down toward the harbour, faint and made fainter still by the fog, the deeper and more authoritative bell of St. Mary's confirms the true hour a few minutes later, its sound travelling up through the wet air in slow, spreading rings, the way a stone's ripples spread across still water. Hester has come to think of midnight, across 15 years of these long nights, as a kind of hinge upon which the evening turns, the hour at which the ordinary business of the day, however late it runs, has finally and completely given way to the separate and distinct business of the night proper, which operates, she has observed, by somewhat different rules than the daylight hours obey. The visitors who come before midnight carry generally troubles that the daylight world might also have addressed, had circumstance permitted. A cold journey, a long working day, a grief that simple exhaustion has worn raw. But the visitors who come after midnight, in her long experience, carry something else, the particular troubles that only present themselves fully once the rest of the world has gone to sleep and left a person alone with their own thoughts, with nothing left to distract from whatever has been quietly accumulating beneath the day's ordinary business. She rises and adds fresh wood to the fire, building it slightly higher against the deepening cold, and checks the lamp once more, though it requires no checking, and refills both kettles, and performs, in short, the small steady sequence of tasks that has become, across 15 years, less a set of practical necessities than a kind of private liturgy, marking the passage from one phase of the night's work into the next. Outside, the fog has thickened to the point that even the nearest buildings across the narrow width of Mermaid Street have become indistinct, soft grey shapes barely differentiated from the murk around them, so that the Wren and Kettle, with its single steady lamp, might almost be the last lit room in all of England, the only point of warmth and certainty in an otherwise dissolved and formless world. It is, Hester reflects, settling back into her chair with a fresh cup of tea, exactly the kind of night that tends to bring her most particular visitors, the ones who come not for warmth against the weather, but for warmth against something considerably less tangible. She becomes aware of the fourth visitor of the evening, not through any knock at the door, but through a small movement at the edge of her vision. A shape glimpsed through the leaded glass of the window beside the door, standing motionless in the fog outside, neither approaching nor retreating, simply standing in the particular posture of someone who has arrived at a decision point and has not yet managed to cross it. Hester rises and goes to the door herself and opens it before any knock can come, for she has learned across many years that some visitors require the door to be opened for them the final small courage of crossing a threshold being, on certain nights, more than a troubled soul can quite manage alone. The woman standing in the fog is perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in mourning black so complete that even her bonnet's ribbons are black, her face pale and drawn in the lamplight, her eyes carrying the particular hollowed quality of someone who has wept past the point where weeping offers any further relief. "I'm sorry," the woman says, before Hester can speak. "I did not mean to stand staring at your window. I have been walking, and I saw the light, and I—" She stops, her composure visibly fraying. "I do not know why I stopped. I should go on." "You should come in," Hester says gently, "and sit by the fire and have something warm, and then decide whatever you need to decide, with rather more clarity than the fog and the cold are presently allowing you." The woman hesitates one moment longer, and then, with the particular collapse of someone whose resistance has simply run out of strength to maintain itself, she steps across the threshold and into the warm, low-beamed room, and Hester closes the door behind her against the fog and the dark, and the Wren and Kettle, for the 4th time this night, opens its arms to receive a sorrow it had not specifically expected, but was, as always, entirely ready to meet. Her name, she offers eventually, prompted by nothing more than the simple kindness of a cup of tea pressed into her cold hands and a chair drawn close to the fire, is Margaret Penhallow, and she has come from the churchyard of St. Mary, where she has spent, she is not entirely certain how long, the hours having lost their ordinary shape somewhere in the course of the evening, sitting beside a grave that is, by the calendar that governs such things, exactly 1 year old tonight. "My husband," she says, in answer to Hester's gentle, unpressing question. "Richard. He was thrown from his horse on the Winchelsea Road a year ago this very night, and died 3 days after, of injuries the doctors could not properly mend. We had been married 4 years. We had no children." She says this last with a particular flatness that suggests the absence of children has become, over the year of her widowhood, one more small grief layered atop the larger one, the knowledge that she carries nothing forward of the marriage except memory, with no small face to remind her, daily, of the man she lost. "I did not mean to stay at the grave so long tonight," she continues, her hands tightening around the cup. "I went only to sit with him a while, as I have done most weeks this past year. But tonight, somehow, I could not bring myself to leave. I sat in the cold and the fog until I could no longer feel my feet properly, and even then, I think I might have stayed longer, had the cold not finally frightened me into moving, more from instinct than any clear decision." Hester listens to this with the particular quality of attention she has learned, across 15 years, to offer to grief of this specific kind, the grief of an anniversary, which carries a weight and a shape distinct from ordinary mourning, the calendar itself becoming, on such nights, an additional and unwelcome participant in the sorrow. "A year is a strange marker," Hester says, when Margaret falls silent. "It asks us to have arrived somewhere we have not, in truth, arrived. The world expects, rather unreasonably I have always thought, that grief should observe its own anniversary properly, and then begin, from that point, to recede in some orderly fashion. It rarely does anything of the kind." "No," Margaret agrees, with something like relief in her voice. as though she has been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to say precisely this. It does not recede at all, some days. Today, least of all. I lost my own husband 15 years ago, Hester says, and watches the particular shift in Margaret's expression, the small recognition, the realization that the woman before her is not simply offering practiced comfort, but speaking from a knowledge earned at the same considerable cost. 15 years, Margaret repeats, somewhat wonderingly. And does it, forgive me, I do not know how to ask this properly, does it ever become bearable? I do not ask whether it ends, for I think I have understood this past year that it does not end. But does it become bearable in time? Some days I cannot imagine carrying this weight for 15 more years, let alone the 40 or 50 that might, God willing, still lie ahead of me. Hester considers the question with the seriousness it deserves, turning her own cup slowly in her hands as she gathers her thoughts. It becomes, she says at last, a different kind of weight than it is tonight. I will not lie to you and say it grows light, for I do not think that would be honest, and I suspect you would know it for a lie regardless of how kindly I meant it. But I will tell you this. The weight finds, eventually, its own place to rest within you, rather than pressing always upon the same raw spot. There are whole days now when I do not think of Samuel with grief at all, but simply with the ordinary fondness one carries for someone deeply loved and long known, the way one might think of a parent long dead or a childhood home no longer standing. And then there are other days, his birthday, the date of his death, certain qualities of light upon the harbour that recall some particular memory, when the grief returns nearly as sharp as it was at the beginning. But those days have grown fewer across 15 years and further between, and I have learned to expect them, and even, in a strange way, to welcome them when they come, as a kind of visit from him, rather than dreading them as setbacks in some imagined progress toward being entirely healed. A visit, Margaret repeats softly. I had not thought of it that way. It took me a good many years to think of it that way myself, Hester admits. For a long while I fought the sharp days, as though they represented some failure on my part to have properly recovered. It was only later that I came to understand grief is not a wound that closes in the way a cut closes, leaving smooth skin behind. It is more like a room in a house, a room you built without quite meaning to the day you lost him, and which remains a part of the house's structure forever after. You do not spend every day in that room. Most days, you live in the other rooms, going about the ordinary business of living. But the room is there, and on certain days, you find yourself standing in its doorway again. And that is not failure, Mrs. Penhallow. That is simply love, continuing to do what love does, even after the person it was for is gone. Margaret is quiet for some while after this, drinking her tea slowly, her eyes fixed upon the fire with the particular unfocused gaze of someone turning new thoughts over carefully, testing their weight before deciding whether to accept them. I have been afraid, she says eventually, that if the grief ever does grow lighter, it will mean I have somehow loved him less than I believed I did, that the sharpness of the pain is the only proof I have left that the love was real. I understand that fear very well, Hester says. I felt it myself in the early years. But I will tell you what I came to believe instead, across the long passage of these 15 years. The love does not require the pain to remain sharp in order to remain real. Look here. She reaches up and touches, briefly, the small tarnished silver fishhook pinned at her collar. This was his, a small thing. He wore it on his cap, for luck, every time he went out with the boats, and it was found among his effects after. I have worn it every day for 15 years, and I do not think of him with sharp grief each time my fingers brush against it, as I do now without quite meaning to. Most days, it is simply a part of getting dressed, the way any habit becomes automatic over enough years. But the love that put it there, on that first terrible morning, when I could not bear to leave it in a drawer, that love has not diminished one particle, for all that the daily wearing of it no longer brings tears. It has simply become woven into the ordinary fabric of my life, rather than standing apart from it as a constant fresh wound. Margaret reaches up, almost without thinking, to touch her own black collar, where no such token rests, and Hester notices the gesture and understands it perfectly. "Did Richard leave you anything?" she asks gently, "that you might carry in such a way, not to replace the grief, but to give the love somewhere ordinary to live alongside it?" "His watch," Margaret says slowly, as though the thought is arriving fresh even as she speaks it. "I have kept it in a drawer this past year because I could not bear to look at it. Perhaps," she stops, considering, "perhaps it is time I took it out again." By the time Margaret Penhallow rises to leave, the fire's warmth and the long, quiet conversation have done their gradual work upon her, and though the grief has not lifted, Hester would not have expected it to, nor would she have trusted any comfort capable of lifting a year-old grief in a single evening. Something in the particular rigid quality of her sorrow has softened. The desperate edge that drove her from the churchyard into the fog now settled into something closer to simple, manageable sadness. "I should go home," she says, drawing her black shawl back about her shoulders. I had not realized how late the hour had grown. "Will you be well, walking?" Hester asks, with the particular practical concern of a woman who has, across 15 years, learned to attend to the physical safety of her visitors as carefully as their emotional well-being. "I lodge only at the bottom of the hill near the Strand," Margaret says. "It is no great distance, even in this fog. I know the way by heart, regardless of what I can or cannot see of it tonight." She pauses at the door, as so many of Hester's visitors have paused before her, looking back at the small warm room with its fire and its mismatched cups, and there is something in her expression, not quite peace, for peace would be too large a word for what one evening's conversation can accomplish, but something adjacent to it, a kind of settling that Hester has learned to recognize as the particular mark her house leaves upon those who pass through it in genuine need. "Thank you, Mrs. Allenby," Margaret says. "I do not think I would have made it home tonight, in any proper sense, without having stopped here. I might have walked the streets till dawn, or worse, gone back to the churchyard and sat there till the cold finished what the grief had already begun." "You need not thank me," Hester says, though she says it with evident warmth, accepting the gratitude even as she deflects its full weight. "Take out Richard's watch when you are home." Wind it if it still keeps time. Let it be a small, ordinary thing in your life again, rather than a wound kept locked away. That is thanks enough for me, knowing that some good has followed you out of this room and into the rest of your life. Margaret nods and steps out into the fog and is gone, and Hester closes the door behind her and stands a moment with her hands still upon the latch, feeling, as she so often feels at such moments, the particular quiet satisfaction of having done, once again, exactly the work this house was built to do. It is past 1 in the morning, the clock that runs 5 minutes fast, confirming it, and the deep bell of St. Mary's, some minutes later, confirming it again with its own more sober authority. When the 5th visitor of the evening arrives, and this one comes not seeking entry, but simply pausing, as he has paused most nights for the better part of a decade, in the particular pattern of his rounds. Old Ezra Plum is Rye's night watchman, a position that has existed in some form since the town's medieval centuries, when the threat of French raiders made a vigilant eye upon the harbour a matter of genuine civic necessity, and which persists now, in this gentler age, more as tradition and modest reassurance than urgent need, though Ezra performs his rounds with exactly the same diligence his predecessors brought to genuine danger, walking the town's narrow streets through every hour of the night, checking doors, noting any irregularity, calling out the hour at intervals to the sleeping households above. He does not enter the Wren and Kettle most nights, his rounds permitting only a brief pause, but tonight, with the fog thick enough that even his decades of familiarity with these streets have been somewhat tested, he raps once upon the doorframe and puts his head inside. His weathered face, he must be past 70, though no one in Rye, including Ezra himself, seems entirely certain of his precise age, creased with the particular satisfaction of a man confirming that all remains as it should be. "All quiet, Mrs. Allenby?" he asks, as he asks most nights, his voice carrying the particular gravelly quality of a lifetime spent calling out the hours into the dark. "All quiet, Mr. Plum," Hester confirms, as she confirms most nights. "Will you not come in a moment, out of this fog? I've a fresh pot just made." He hesitates, as he generally does, caught between the discipline of his rounds and the evident comfort of the fire, and then, as he generally decides, steps inside and pulls the door to behind him, though he does not sit, preferring, even on his rare pauses, to remain standing in the particular alert posture of a man who considers himself, even off his official path for a few minutes, still essentially on duty. He accepts the cup she offers, but does not drink from it at once, instead turning toward the small framed photograph above the mantel with the particular fond recognition of someone who has known its subject far longer than most. "I think of him often, on a night like this," Ezra says, nodding towards Samuel's image. Fog thick enough, a man could near drown standing on dry land, and cold enough to bite through any coat that isn't properly oiled against it. "I was on my rounds the night he was lost, you know. Different stretch of the town than I usually walk now. But I remember the weather of it clear as anything, 15 years on. We none of us knew, that night, what the sea was doing to him out there, while the rest of us slept warm and safe in our beds. I have never blamed the town for sleeping, Ezra," Hester says, gently but firmly. For this is not the first time this particular conversation has unfolded between them across the years, and she recognizes in it not an accusation, but a kind of ongoing private penance Ezra performs, in his own way, much as she performs hers with the lamp and the open door. A town cannot keep itself perpetually awake against every possible misfortune. That is not how towns or people are built to live. No, Ezra agrees, but I've thought more than once these 15 years that if my rounds had carried me down toward the Strand that particular night, instead of up toward the church as they did, I might have seen something. A light needed lighting, a door needed opening, something, anything that might have made the difference between him reaching home and not reaching it. You cannot carry that, Ezra, Hester says, with the particular firm gentleness of someone who has had occasion to say this exact thing to this exact man more than once across the years. I have made my peace with what happened to Samuel, as much peace as such a thing permits. I would not have you carrying a guilt that was never properly yours to carry, simply because your rounds that night happened to fall in one direction rather than another. I know it, Ezra says, with the particular sigh of a man acknowledging a truth his feelings have not entirely caught up with. I tell myself the same most nights, but I confess that's no small part of why I make a point of pausing here. When my rounds bring me past your door of an evening, it eases something in me to see the lamp still burning and to know that whatever good can still be done on a foggy night such as this one is being done, even if it could not be done in time for Samuel himself. Hester sets down her own cup and looks at Ezra with the particular careful attention of someone about to say something she has, perhaps, been waiting some while for the right occasion to say. You have walked these streets every night for what, 30 years now, Ezra Plum? Near enough, he confirms. My father did it before me, and his father before him, near as far back as anyone troubles to remember. Then let me tell you something I have come to believe across my own 15 years of keeping this particular watch. Hester says, you did not fail Samuel that night 15 years ago, any more than the rest of Rye failed him by sleeping. But I think, perhaps, that some part of you has spent these 15 years walking your rounds with rather more diligence than the position strictly requires, precisely because of what happened that night, checking doors that scarcely need checking, calling the hours into streets where most folk would scarcely notice if you missed a call or two. And I do not think that is a burden you carry, Ezra, however it may feel some nights. I think it is a gift you give this town every single night, in Samuel's memory, as much as in service of your official duty. You and I are not so very different in that regard. We have both turned a private grief into a public vigilance, each in our own particular fashion. And I do not think either of us should apologize for it, or imagine it some failure rather than what it actually is. Ezra is quiet for a long moment, turning this over with the particular slow consideration of a man unaccustomed to having his own motives examined quite so directly, even by someone who knows him as well as Hester does. I had not thought of it in quite those terms, he says at last. But I believe you may be right, Mrs. Allenby. I believe you may be entirely right. He finishes his tea in a final long swallow and sets the cup down, straightening with the particular renewed purpose of a man whose rounds, interrupted briefly by reflection, now call him onward again. I'll be getting on then. Streets don't watch themselves, fog or no fog. Mind the step at the bottom of Watchbell Street, Hester says, as she says most nights when he departs. It's been treacherous in wet weather since before either of us were born. 40 years I've minded that step, Mrs. Allenby, Ezra says, with something that might almost be a smile beneath his weathered gravity. I expect I'll go on minding it 40 more if my legs hold out that long. And he is gone, back out into the fog and his endless patient rounds, and Hester watches him go through the small leaded window before returning to her chair and to the fire and to the long remaining stretch of the night still ahead of her. Past 2 o'clock now, the clock 5 minutes fast, confirming it with its small steady tick, and Rye has settled into the particular profound quiet that belongs to this specific hour of the night, when even the latest of the town's ordinary households have long since surrendered to sleep, and the fog outside has thickened to a density that seems, at moments, to press almost physically against the small leaded windows of the Wren and Kettle, as though the whole of Romney Marsh had risen up in slow grey tides to claim the sleeping town entirely. Hester has come to know this particular hour across 15 years as the deepest and quietest stretch of her long nightly vigil. The hour least likely to bring visitors, since even those troubled enough to be abroad at midnight or 1 o'clock have generally, by this point, either found their way to some resolution or exhausted themselves into whatever sleep their circumstances permit. It is the hour, more than any other, that belongs to her alone, and across 15 years she has learned not to dread this solitary stretch, but to welcome it as a kind of private sanctuary within the larger structure of her nightly purpose. She banks the fire to its steadiest, most economical burning, conserving the wood against the longer remaining hours still ahead, and refills the lamp once more, though it does not yet require refilling, and takes down from a small shelf beside the dresser that few of her visitors ever notice, a worn leather-bound book in which she has kept, across 15 years, a brief private record of the nights. Not every visitor, for there have been far too many across so many years to record them all, but the particular ones, the nights that mattered in some way beyond the ordinary business of tea and warmth and company. She opens it now to a fresh page and dips her pen and begins in the small, steady hand that 15 years of practice has made entirely her own, to set down the events of this particular foggy November night. 8th November, 1888. Foggy, thick from the marsh by 7, thicker still by midnight. Mr. Tutt through at 7, bringing word of young Williams walking the Iden Road without a coat, a kindness, that his bringing the warning, though I suspect he did not think of it as such. Dr. Fenwick through past 8, exhausted from a difficult birthing at Snargate. Twins, both living, God be thanked, and the boy named Samuel, though the mother could not have known what that name means in this house. I shall think kindly of him, the small Samuel of the marsh, whenever I think of mine. Thomas Williams himself came past 11 in a poor state, having walked some hours in the cold over the business with Susanna Combe. I believe, I hope, he left somewhat steadier than he arrived, though grief of that fresh a kind does not mend in a single evening's conversation, whatever comfort the fire and the talk may offer. I have asked him to come again, should the need arise, and I believe he understood the offer as genuine rather than merely polite. Margaret Penhallow stopped past midnight, a year to the night since she lost her Richard on the Winchelsea Road. She had been sitting at his grave some hours in the cold and fog, more hours than was safe or sensible, and I believe the conversation we had, of grief as a room within the house of oneself, rather than a wound that closes, gave her something to carry forward, though only time itself will tell whether it truly eases her passage through the year ahead. I have asked her to take out her husband's watch from the drawer where she has kept it hidden this past year and let it live again as an ordinary part of her days. I hope she does. Ezra Plum paused on his rounds past 1, as he does most foggy nights, and we spoke again of the old guilt he carries over Samuel, though I believe, I hope, that what I said to him tonight of his rounds as a gift rather than a penance may ease that particular burden somewhat across the years still ahead of him. For troubled souls, on one foggy November night, and the lamp burned steady through all of it, as it has burned steady every night these 15 years, I think Samuel would be satisfied with how I have kept his promise. I think, on nights like this one, I am satisfied with it myself. She closes the book and returns it to its shelf, and sits a moment longer in the deep quiet of the small hours. The fire's steady warmth and the lamp's steady light, her only companions now, the fog outside pressing close against the windows like a held breath, the whole of Rye asleep around her small, persistent point of wakefulness. In these deepest, quietest hours of the night, Hester permits herself a small private ritual that belongs to no visitor, that exists for no purpose beyond her own simple comfort. The making of a particular tea blended to her own taste across many years of small private experimentation that she drinks only in these solitary stretches when the house is, for a time, entirely her own. It is not the everyday blend she serves to most callers, nor the gentler chamomile she keeps for the anxious, nor the dark bracing brew reserved for men come in off the cold boats. It is something else entirely. A blend of black tea with a measure of dried elderflower and a few crushed berries of the hawthorn that grows wild along the lane behind the house, picked each autumn and dried carefully against the long winter ahead, the whole steeped rather longer than is usual, until the resulting cup carries a flavour both bracing and curiously sweet, like the particular taste of a melancholy that has, across long practice, learned to coexist comfortably with contentment. She makes it now, measuring the leaves and the dried flowers with the unhurried precision of long habit, and sets the pot to steep upon the warming shelf above the range while she occupies herself with the small remaining tasks of the deep night hours, straightening the chairs that her evening's visitors have left somewhat disarranged, washing and drying the cups that have accumulated through the evening's custom, restocking the bread and butter against whatever the small hours may yet require. When the tea has steeped to her satisfaction, she pours herself a cup and settles into her own chair by the fire, not the chair reserved for visitors, but a smaller, plainer stool tucked into the corner nearest the window, from which vantage point she can watch both the fire and the fog-wrapped street outside, the position from which, across 15 years, she has spent more solitary hours than any other person could likely guess from the outside. She drinks slowly, savoring the particular bittersweet flavor of her own private blend, and looks toward the small, framed photograph above the mantel, and allows herself, in this quiet, private interval that belongs to no one but herself and the long, faithful memory of her husband, simply to sit with him a while, in the manner that has become, across 15 years, not a sorrow, but a comfort, the particular comfort of company that asks nothing further of her than her own continued presence and remembering. She does not, most nights, speak aloud to the small photograph above the mantel, has never been entirely certain whether such a habit would represent a comfort or a kind of indulgence she ought properly to discourage in herself. But on this particular foggy November night, with the deep, quiet hours stretching long and undisturbed around her, she finds herself, almost without deciding to, speaking softly into the firelit room. "For tonight, Samuel," she says, her eyes upon his squinting, sun-bright image, captured forever at an age he did not live to outgrow. Tut with his news of the Williams boy, and the good doctor exhausted from his marsh birthing, and young Thomas himself, poor lad, walking off a grief he'll learn in time to carry rather than escape. And Margaret Penhallow, a year widowed tonight, sitting too long at her husband's grave in this cold and fog until the lamp brought her in from it. She pauses, turning her cup slowly in her hands. I told her what I have come to understand across these 15 years, that grief finds its own room within us, and we visit it sometimes, and that is not failure, but simply love continuing on. I do not know if I believed it myself in the early years, when I first began saying such things to comfort others, but I believe it now. I have had 15 years to test the truth of it, and I find it has held. She is quiet a moment, listening to the fire and the distant, fog-muffled sound of the sea below the town. Ezra came by too, still carrying his old guilt about that night, though I hope, what I said to him eased it somewhat. He does not need to carry what was never his to carry. None of them do, the people who slept through that night 15 years ago, simply because a town cannot keep itself perpetually wakeful against every possible misfortune. She finishes her tea and sets the cup aside and looks a final moment at the photograph, her thumb finding, without conscious decision, the small tarnished fishhook at her collar. I keep your promise still, she says softly. Every night. The lamp has not gone out once these 15 years, and I do not intend that it ever shall, so long as I have strength to fill the oil and trim the wick. Whatever good I can still do in this world, I think I do it best by keeping that door open, just as you would have wanted, just as I promised you I would. That first terrible morning when they brought you home. The fire crackles softly in answer, and somewhere far off, muffled by the fog, the bell of St. Mary's marks the half-hour, and Hester Allenby sits a while longer in the deep, quiet company of her own long, faithful memory, before rising at last to attend to the small remaining hours of the night still ahead of her. It is past 3 in the morning, the deepest and most difficult hour of the night by Hester's long experience, the hour when the body's own exhaustion presses hardest against whatever troubles have kept a person from their bed, when the 6th visitor of the evening arrives, and this one comes with the particular restless agitation of someone who has been pacing, rather than walking with purpose for some considerable time before finally surrendering to the lamp's quiet invitation. She is young, no more than 25, dressed plainly but neatly in the manner of a respectable working woman, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her eyes red-rimmed, not with weeping, but with the particular strain of someone who has not slept properly in some days and does not expect to sleep tonight either. "I am sorry to disturb you at such an hour," she says, hovering uncertainly at the threshold. "I saw your light, and I could not—" She stops, twisting her hands together in the particular gesture of barely contained anxiety. "I could not bear to be alone with my own thoughts a moment longer." "Then you have come to exactly the right door," Hester says, with the particular warm certainty that has welcomed 5 troubled souls already this night, and finds, in this 6th arrival, no diminishment of its readiness. "Come in and sit, and tell me what has kept you from your bed at 3 in the morning, or do not tell me, and simply sit a while in company instead. Either suits this room perfectly well." The young woman steps inside and gives her name eventually, prompted by the same gentle, unpressing kindness that has drawn confidences from every visitor before her this night, as Sarah Beckwith, wife to a sailor presently 3 weeks overdue from a voyage that should, by all the ordinary reckoning of such things, have brought him home a fortnight past. "I keep telling myself it is only the weather," she says, accepting the cup Hester presses into her cold hands. "The autumn gales have been bad this year. Everyone says so, and a delayed ship is no uncommon thing, not truly. But I cannot stop my mind from running to the worst of it, especially at night, when there is nothing to occupy my thoughts but waiting, and the waiting itself becomes a kind of torment I cannot seem to set down, however I try." Hester listens to this with a particular and immediate recognition, for there is no story among all the many sorrows that have passed through her door across 15 years that touches closer to her own original wound than this one. A wife waiting through the night hours for a husband whose return the sea has not yet decided to permit. "How long has he been gone?" she asks gently. 4 months, Sarah says. "He sails with a merchant vessel out of London, the China trade. Long voyages, but generally reliable in their timing, give or take a fortnight either way for weather. This is the longest he has ever been overdue, and I cannot—" her voice catches. "I cannot stop imagining the very worst, especially at night, when there is no daylight business to distract me from it. I understand that particular torment better than almost anyone you are likely to meet," Hester says quietly, and something in her voice causes Sarah to look up properly for the first time, really seeing the woman before her rather than simply the warmth and the tea she has offered. "You have lost someone to the sea," Sarah says. Not quite a question. The recognition of a fellow sufferer passing between them in the particular way such recognitions do. "My husband, 15 years ago," Hester confirms. "Not lost in the manner you fear for your own, not vanished without account. He was found the morning after, though it was too late by then to matter. But I knew, in the hours before that finding, exactly the particular agony you are presently enduring, the mind running ahead to every possible disaster, the body unable to rest while the not knowing stretches on and on. I would not insult you by pretending the waiting is easy, or that worry of this kind can simply be reasoned away. by good sense and patience, it cannot. But I can tell you this, from my own hard-earned experience, the waiting itself, however terrible, is not yet the disaster. It is only the uncertainty. An uncertainty, however painful, still contains within it every possible outcome, including the good ones. I try to remember that, Sarah says, in the daylight hours, when there is work to occupy my hands and my mind both. But here, in the night, with nothing but the fog and the waiting, that is precisely why the lamp is lit. Hester says, the night hours are when the worry presses hardest, and when a person most needs somewhere to bring it besides the empty rooms of their own house. You did exactly right, coming here tonight, rather than pacing alone until dawn. They talk for a long while, the fire burning steady between them, of the particular cruelty of the sea's uncertain timing, how it offers no letters, no telegraph, no reliable means by which a waiting wife might learn in advance of the ship's actual arrival whether her husband sails safely home or lies, even now, beneath some far ocean swell, his family will never properly know the circumstances of. I think, Hester says, at one point in their long conversation, that the particular cruelty of a sailor's wife's waiting is that it asks you to hold two entirely opposite possibilities in your mind at once, with equal weight, for as long as the uncertainty persists. The ship is safe and merely delayed by weather. The ship is lost and you simply do not yet know it. Both are true, in the sense that both remain genuinely possible, right up until the moment one or the other resolves itself into fact, and the mind, asked to hold two such opposite truths simultaneously, night after night, finds the strain of it almost unbearable, however much the daylight hours allow us to distract ourselves from the holding of it. That is exactly it, Sarah says, with the particular relief of someone hearing their own private torment, named precisely by another voice. I had not found words for it myself, but that is exactly the shape of what I have been carrying these past weeks. For what small comfort it may offer, Hester continues, I will tell you that in my own experience, and in the experience of every sailor's wife I have sat with across these 15 years in this very chair, the delayed ships have, far more often than not, simply been delayed by weather, by trade business in some foreign port, by the 1,000 ordinary complications that attend any long sea voyage and have nothing whatsoever to do with disaster. I do not say this to promise you that your own husband's ship is certainly among the safely delayed rather than the genuinely lost, for I have no power to promise any such thing and would not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I can tell you from long observation that the odds favor delay over disaster by a considerable margin, however little that statistical comfort may ease the particular sharp edge of tonight's waiting. Sarah is quiet a long moment, turning this over. Will you tell me, she asks finally, very low, what it was like that last night before you knew, before they found him? And Hester, recognizing in the question not morbid curiosity, but the particular need of a woman seeking some companionship in her own present darkness, tells her gently, honestly, without sparing the truth of how terrible that long waiting night had been, but also without sparing the truth of how she had, eventually, across 15 years, learned to carry what came after it and to build from the wreckage of that worst possible outcome a life that still, in its own particular fashion, held meaning, and even on certain nights such as this one, something close to joy. By the time their long conversation has run its natural course, the worst of Sarah's frantic agitation has settled into something quieter, not resolved, for the uncertainty itself remains entirely unresolved. Her husband's ship no nearer its harbour, for all the talking that has passed between them, but borne now with rather more steadiness than the desperate pacing that brought her to Hester's door some hours before. "I do not think I can sleep tonight, regardless," Sarah admits as the clock that runs 5 minutes fast approaches 4. "But I believe I can return home now and lie quietly at least, rather than walking the streets in this fog till dawn finds me." "That is no small improvement," Hester says, rising to see her to the door. "And Sarah, you are welcome here. Any night the waiting grows too heavy to carry alone. I do not say that as mere politeness. I mean it precisely as I say it. This door is open for exactly this kind of vigil, and I have sat with a good many sailors' wives across 15 years, through waits both shorter and considerably longer than yours has yet become. You need not face the night hours alone, so long as my lamp burns in this window." "Thank you, Mrs. Allenby," Sarah says, drawing her shawl close against the fog waiting beyond the door. I hope that when Thomas does come home, safe and well as I am trying very hard to believe he will, I should like to bring him here myself, that he might thank you in person for the company you have given his wife through these long, uncertain weeks." "I should like that very much," Hester says, and means it entirely, for there are few greater satisfactions in her long nightly vigil than the eventual, hoped-for moment when a worry she has helped someone carry resolves, at last, into safe and ordinary relief. Sarah steps out into the fog, which has begun in these deepest hours before dawn, to show the first faint signs of thinning, the particular grey lightning that suggests morning's slow approach is not, after all, infinitely distant, and Hester watches her go down the steep cobbled street until the fog swallows her entirely, and then closes the door and returns to her fire, and to the lamp, and to the small remaining stretch of darkness still separating this long night from its eventual dawn. Past 4 in the morning now, and the Wren and Kettle settles into what Hester has come, across 15 years, to think of as the quietest and most sacred hour of the entire long night, the stretch between the deepest darkness and the first faint suggestion of dawn, when even the most troubled souls of the town have generally either found their way home or surrendered finally to whatever exhausted sleep their circumstances permit, and the streets of Rye lie entirely empty and still beneath their blanket of slowly thinning fog. She does not expect further visitors at this hour, though she has learned, across many years, never to assume the night entirely finished its business simply because the clock has reached a particular late point. There have been nights, rare but memorable, when the most significant visitor of all arrived in these very last hours before dawn, as though some particular trouble had required the whole long night's accumulated darkness to finally drive its bearer toward the lamp's patient light. She uses the quiet hour as she has used such hours across 15 years, tending the small remaining practical business of the house, restocking what the evening's custom has depleted, banking the fire to its most economical overnight burning. And when the practical tasks are complete, simply sitting with her own thoughts in the particular settled stillness that this hour, more than any other, provides. The fog beyond the windows has begun, definitively now, to lift, thinning from its earlier impenetrable density into something more like a low grey mist clinging close to the cobbles, through which the first faint suggestion of the buildings opposite, black timber, leaded glass, the steep climbing line of Mermaid Street itself, has begun slowly to reassert itself against the dissolving dark. Somewhere down toward the harbour, a single gull cries out, the first sound of the waking world to break the long night's profound silence. And Hester, hearing it, feels the particular quiet satisfaction that has marked the conclusion of so many of her long vigils across 15 years. The sense of a night's work, whatever shape it has taken, drawing now toward its natural and peaceful close. It is past 5, the sky beyond the windows showing for the first time the faint suggestion of grey that precedes true dawn, when the 7th and final visitor of this long night arrives, and Hester, hearing the particular slow, careful tread upon the cobbles outside, knows before the door even opens exactly who has come. Old Tobias Marsh has fished these waters for 60 years and more, and was, 15 years ago, one of the 2 men who returned safely from the boat that took Samuel Allenby, the 3rd man among them, into the cold November sea that would not, that particular night, give him back alive. He comes to the Wren and Kettle, perhaps once a month, always at this particular pre-dawn hour, always on nights when sleep has eluded him entirely, and Hester has long since stopped asking why, understanding, without needing the question answered aloud, exactly what private reckoning brings him here. "Mrs. Allenby," he says, his voice rough with age and with the salt-roughened years of a lifetime upon the water, stepping inside with the particular careful slowness of a body that has given 60 years of hard labour to the sea, and is, now, well past the age when such labour comes easily. "Mr. Marsh, sit by the fire. You'll have the dark blend, I expect." "If it's no trouble," he says, settling into the chair with a long exhale, his weathered face in the lamplight, carrying the particular tiredness of a man for whom sleep has become, across the years, an increasingly unreliable companion. She brings him the tea and sits with him in the particular comfortable silence that 15 years of these occasional pre-dawn visits has built between them, a silence that requires no filling, since both parties understand, without needing to articulate it, exactly what private business has brought this old fisherman to this particular door at this particular hour, on this particular night, so close to the anniversary that, properly reckoned, falls not tonight, but in 3 days more. Though grief, as Hester has told so many visitors across this long evening, rarely observes the calendar's precise reckoning with any great fidelity. "I dream of it still," he says eventually, into the quiet, his eyes fixed upon the fire rather than upon her, in the particular manner of a man confessing something he finds easier to say to flames than to a face. 15 years on, and I still dream of that night, more often than I'd care to admit to most folk. The wind and the black water, and Samuel's voice calling out to us across it, and the particular moment when his voice stopped, and we could not tell, in all that dark and noise, whether it had stopped because he'd found some safety we couldn't see, or because he does not finish the sentence, has never, across 15 years of these occasional confessions, quite managed to finish it. You did everything that could be done, Tobias, Hester says, gently but firmly. For this too is a conversation they have had many times across the years, each repetition offering, she has come to believe, some small additional measure of ease, even if the full burden never quite lifts entirely. I know it, in my head, he says. I have told myself the very same, 10,000 times across 15 years. We could not see him, in that black water, in that wind. We searched as long as the boat could hold against the weather, and longer than was strictly safe for the rest of us. And there was nothing more two exhausted men in a small boat could have done that night, to find a third man already lost beneath dark water in a gale. I know all this, but knowing it in the head and feeling it in the chest, Mrs. Allenby, those are two very different matters, and I confess that 15 years has not yet managed to make the second one match the first. No, Hester says, I do not suppose it has. I think some griefs are built that way, known clearly enough by the mind, but never quite settled by the heart, however many years pass. She pauses, considering him with the particular careful attention she has offered to every troubled soul across this long night. But Tobias, I want you to hear this from me, plainly, one final time, because I think it bears repeating as often as you need it said. I have never blamed you, not for one single hour of these 15 years. You brought your own boat home safe that terrible night, and you have spent every year since coming to my door, on the nights it troubles you most, to confess a guilt I have never once asked you to carry. I release you from it again tonight, as I have released you before, and I will go on releasing you from it for as many more years as you need to hear it said. Tobias is quiet for a long while after this, his weathered hands wrapped around his cooling cup, and when he speaks again, his voice carries a different quality, not the raw confession of moments before, but something gentler, more reflective, as though Hester's words have, this particular time, found some slightly deeper purchase than the 14 previous times she has spoken them. I think, he says slowly, that I keep coming back to this house these 15 years, not only to confess what troubles me, but because there is something here that eases it in a way I cannot find anywhere else. The lamp, I mean, and the fire, and you sitting here ready to receive whatever a man brings to your door at 5 in the morning. I have wondered more than once whether Samuel himself understood before his death what manner of legacy his loss would build. This house, open every night, easing 100 small griefs it was never specifically meant to address, simply because his widow decided that no one else should ever freeze in the dark the way he did. I do not think he could have imagined it in any specific sense, Hester says. I do not think I imagined it myself in those first terrible weeks, beyond the simple determination that the door would not close. But I have come to believe, across these 15 years, that this is often how the largest goods grow from the worst losses, not through any grand design, but through one small stubborn decision made in grief that simply continues night after night until it has become, almost without anyone properly noticing the accumulation, something considerably larger than its original intention. Tobias nods slowly and finishes his tea, and the sky beyond the small leaded windows has lightened further still, the grey of pre-dawn now carrying the faintest suggestion of the warmer colours that will, within the hour, properly announce the day's arrival. "I should let you rest, Mrs. Allenby," he says, rising with the particular careful slowness of his age. "You've kept this lamp burning the whole night through, I'd wager, same as every night, and I've no business keeping you from whatever rest the day permits you, simply to ease my own old conscience at this unreasonable hour." "You are never a burden, Tobias," Hester says, rising also to see him to the door. "Come again, whenever the dreams trouble you. The door does not keep particular hours for particular griefs, as I have told a good many visitors this very night. It is open for whatever finds its way to it, at whatever hour that finding occurs." Tobias Marsh steps out into the thinning fog, his careful tread receding slowly down the steep cobbles of Mermaid Street, and Hester stands a moment in the open doorway, watching him go before the particular pre-dawn chill, sharper somehow than the deep night's cold had been, as though the air itself were gathering its strength for one final assertion before surrendering to the coming day, persuades her to close the door once more and return to the warmth of her fire. The room, in the wake of this seventh and final visitor's departure, settles into the particular emptied quiet that Hester has come to know across 15 years as the signal that the night's true business has, for this occasion, concluded. The fire burns low and steady. The lamp continues its patient vigil in the window, though its light now competes, increasingly, with the strengthening grey of the sky beyond, the long night finally surrendering its hold upon Rye in favour of whatever the new day will bring. She gathers the scattered cups, Tutt's and Fenwick's and Thomas Williams's and Margaret Penhallow's and Ezra Plum's and Sarah Beckwith's and Tobias Marsh's, 7 cups in all, each one having carried across this single long night its own particular measure of comfort to its own particular bearer of trouble, and carries them to the basin behind the dresser, where she washes each one carefully, restoring them to the shelf above, ready once more for whatever the coming night might require of them. She thinks as she works of the particular accumulated weight of this single night's visitors, a frightened mother's worry brought by a carrier, a doctor's exhaustion after fighting for 2 small lives, a young man's grief over love denied him, a widow's anniversary sorrow, an old watchman's guilt he need not carry, a sailor's wife's uncertain vigil, an old fisherman's 15-year confession, and feels, as she so often feels at the conclusion of such a night, the particular quiet but profound satisfaction of having been useful in this small persistent way to 7 separate sorrows that the ordinary daylight world might not have had adequate space or quiet to properly address. It has been, she reflects, settling back into her chair as the cups dry upon their shelf, an entirely ordinary night by the particular standards her 15 years of keeping this house have established. And it has also, in its own quiet way, been exactly the kind of night that makes the whole long undertaking worthwhile. The sky beyond the small leaded windows has, by the time Hester finishes her washing of the cups, lightened into the particular pale gold that announces, on a clear November morning, the sun's imminent rising over the marshes to the east. The fog of the long night, now reduced to thin, dissolving wisps clinging close to the lowest ground, while the higher reaches of the town, including the steep climb of Mermaid Street itself, have emerged entirely clear into the cold, clean light of the new day. She crosses to the window and extinguishes the lamp, not because the promise it represents has concluded, for it will be relit again this very evening, as it has been relit every evening for 15 years, but because the lamp's purpose is to guide travellers through darkness, and the darkness, for this particular night, has finally and properly given way to the daylight world's own more generous illumination. From this window, she can see down the steep length of Mermaid Street toward the harbour below, where the first fishing boats of the morning are beginning their preparations, the masts black against the pale gold sky, the gulls wheeling and crying above the quay in their endless morning business, the town of Rye waking slowly and methodically into another ordinary day. She thinks, watching this familiar and beloved scene, of Samuel, not with the sharp, particular grief of the early years, but with the settled, companionable fondness that 15 years of careful tending have built from that original terrible loss, the particular comfort of someone long known and long loved, present now, not in the daily ache of his absence, but in the steady continuing work of the promise she keeps in his memory, night after night, regardless of weather or season, or her own occasional weariness. The bell of St. Mary's, clearly audible now in the clean morning air, strikes 6, and Hester Allenby, having kept her vigil through another full night of fog and trouble and quiet comfort offered to 7 separate souls in need of it, allows herself, at last, the particular permission of rest. Behind the small public room of the Wren and Kettle, reached through a low doorway that requires even Hester's modest height to duck slightly beneath its ancient lintel, lies a small chamber that serves, during the long nights of her vigil, as her own private refuge, not a proper bedroom, for she does not, in the ordinary course of her nightly business, sleep through the dark hours when her presence in the front room is most required, but a small space containing a narrow cot, a single chair, and a small window looking out over the modest yard behind the house, where the well that has served this property since long before her time stands beside a small kitchen garden now bare with November's approach. It is to this room that she retreats each morning when the night's vigil has properly concluded and the daylight world has begun its own separate business, not to sleep through the whole of the coming day, for there is too much practical work still required to maintain the Wren and Kettle's daytime custom as well, but for a few hours' proper rest before the ordinary daylight hours, and eventually the evening's renewed preparation, claim her attention once more. She removes her cap and unpins her grey hair, letting it fall loose about her shoulders in the particular private manner she permits herself only in these solitary morning hours, and sits a moment upon the edge of the narrow cot, feeling in her tired limbs the accumulated weight of a long night's vigil, not an unpleasant tiredness, but the particular honest fatigue of work well and thoroughly done, the body's own quiet acknowledgement that it has been put to good and faithful use through the long, dark hours just concluded. Through the small window, the first proper light of the November morning falls across the narrow cot in a pale gold bar, and somewhere beyond the yard, a robin has begun its small, persistent morning song. the ordinary sounds of the waking world gradually replacing the long night's profound silence. Hester lies down at last upon the narrow cot and pulls the worn quilt, stitched by her own hands across many long winters. Its pattern a simple, repeating design of small wrens echoing the sign above her door, up over her tired shoulders. She does not fall asleep at once, as is generally her custom after such a night, but lies a while in the particular drowsy half-waking state that follows a long vigil's proper conclusion, her mind moving slowly over the night's accumulated business, the way a person might walk slowly through rooms they have just finished tidying, checking that all has been properly set in order before finally permitting themselves to rest. She thinks of Josiah Tutt, somewhere now upon the marsh roads, carrying his cart through whatever remains of the morning's round. His warning about young William's already, she hopes, having served its small useful purpose. She thinks of Dr. Fenwick, perhaps even now sleeping the deep exhausted sleep of a man who has fought successfully for 2 small lives and can, for a few hours at least, set down the considerable weight of that fight. She thinks of Thomas Williams, hopefully resting now in his own bed, rather than still walking the cold roads in his grief. The particular fresh sharpness of his sorrow, perhaps marginally eased by an hour's company and warmth, though she knows, from long experience, the grief of that recent vintage requires considerably more than one night's comfort to properly settle. She thinks of Margaret Penhallow, and hopes, with particular warmth, that the widow has indeed taken her husband's watch from its drawer this morning, and let it begin, again, its small, ordinary place in her continuing life. She thinks of Ezra Plum, still walking his endless faithful rounds somewhere in the awakening town, his old guilt perhaps eased, even if only slightly, by tonight's renewed reassurance. She thinks of Sarah Beckwith, lying in her own bed now, still uncertain of her husband's fate, but perhaps, Hester hopes, somewhat more able to bear that uncertainty for having shared it for one long night with someone who understood its particular weight from hard personal experience. And she thinks last and longest of old Tobias Marsh, carrying still his 15-year guilt, but perhaps she hopes this most of all, carrying it tonight a fraction more lightly than he carried it through the door some hours before. 7 souls, she thinks, drowsing now toward proper sleep, 7 separate troubles brought to her door across one long November night, and each one, in its own particular way, met and held and offered whatever small comfort her 15 years of practice have taught her to offer. It is, she thinks, exactly the work she rose each evening to do. It is, she thinks, exactly the promise she made Samuel, in her own heart, on that terrible morning so long ago, and exactly the promise she has kept, without fail, every single night since. Beyond the small window of her narrow back room, Rye continues its slow, methodical waking into the new day. The fishing boats now properly underway upon the harbour's morning business, the bakers' ovens somewhere down toward the high street, sending their first warm scent of new bread drifting up through the cold morning air, the church bell of St. Mary marking the steady passage of the early hours with its familiar, comforting regularity. The Wren and Kettle, its front room now empty of visitors and its night lamp properly extinguished, stands quiet and undisturbed In the strengthening morning light, the fire in the front room banked low, but not out, never properly out, not in 15 years, ready to be built up again when the day's business eventually requires it. The small leaded windows now showing, instead of fog and darkness, the clear cold blue of a proper November morning. The steep cobbles of Mermaid Street outside glistening with the last of the night's damp, beginning already to dry beneath the climbing sun. Somewhere in the town, Josiah Tutt continues his marsh round, his warning about Thomas Williams already passed along, and, in its own quiet way, having helped guide a troubled young man back toward warmth and shelter before the worst of his grief could claim him entirely. Somewhere, Dr. Fenwick sleeps his hard-earned rest, 2 new small lives safely delivered into a world that will, in their own time, grow to know nothing of the desperate hours their arrival cost their tired young physician. Somewhere, Margaret Penhallow perhaps takes a small silver watch from a drawer where grief had kept it hidden for a year, and wins it and lets it begin again its small, ordinary ticking in her continuing life. And somewhere in the small back room of an old crooked tea house on the steepest street of an old town that has made its private arrangement with time, Hester Allenby sleeps at last, her grey hair loose upon the pillow, her weathered hand resting, even in sleep, near the small tarnished fishhook at her collar, the particular settled piece of a long night's faithful vigil, now properly and fully complete. She will wake, in a few hours, to the ordinary business of the daylight world, the modest custom of travellers and townsfolk who require, during the proper waking hours, nothing more than an ordinary cup of tea and perhaps a slice of bread, the small practical tasks of restocking and tending that any establishment of this kind requires to continue its operation. And when the light begins once more to fail over the marshes, and the evening's particular quality of approaching dusk settles over Rye's steep cobbled streets, she will perform again the small steady sequence of tasks, the banking of the fire, the trimming of the lamp's wick, the checking of the small hand-lettered card that has not moved from its place in 15 years, by which the Wren and Kettle transforms itself once more from an ordinary establishment into the particular sanctuary it has become for this town's long, dark hours. The lamp will burn again tonight, as it has burned every single night for 15 years, regardless of weather or season or the particular weariness any individual evening's vigil might leave behind it. The door will stand unlocked, ready to open before any knock upon it has fully finished sounding. The kettles will simmer, the cups will wait upon their shelf, and Hester Allenby will sit once more in her chair near the fire, with whatever small mending or quiet task the evening offers, prepared to receive whatever trouble the fog and the dark and the long, uncertain hours of the night might bring to her door. This is not she has come to understand across 15 years of such nights, a burden she carries reluctantly, nor a penance performed in guilt or obligation, but something closer to a calling properly answered, the particular work that her own great loss prepared her, uniquely among all the souls of Rye, to perform for others enduring their own separate griefs and uncertainties and frightened, solitary hours. Samuel did not live to see what his loss would build, but Hester believes, with the particular settled conviction that 15 years of faithful practice has earned her that he would recognize in the lamp that burns each night in their window, and in the door that never properly closes against the dark, exactly the promise she made him, and exactly the love that continues still to keep it. For now, though, in this particular pale gold morning, with the long night's vigil properly concluded, and 7 troubled souls sent back out into the world, carrying each in their own measure whatever small comfort the Wren and Kettle's fire and conversation could offer them, the house itself rests quiet and undisturbed, its public room empty, its fire banked low, its lamp extinguished against the morning's own more generous light. The framed photograph above the mantel watches over the empty room with its permanent, unchanging gaze. A young man squinting against the long-set sun, his arm around a young woman who would, across the 4 decades since that photograph was taken, become the keeper of this particular flame, the tender of this particular vigil, the woman who turned her own worst loss into the steady, faithful comfort of 100, 1,000 separate strangers' darkest hours. The mismatched cups rest clean and ready upon their shelf. The canisters of tea, the everyday blend, the gentle chamomile, the dark bracing brew for cold sailors, and the private elderflower blend that belongs to no visitor but Hester herself, stand in their accustomed order, ready for whatever the coming evening's custom requires of them. The small leather-bound ledger rests upon its shelf beside the dresser, its pages carrying in Hester's own steady hand the accumulated record of 15 years' worth of nights, not unlike this one, each entry a small private testament to a promise kept, a sorrow eased, a frightened soul guided safely through the particular darkness of a difficult hour. The town of Rye continues its ordinary morning business around this small quiet house. The fishermen at their boats, the bakers at their ovens, the children, soon enough, on their way to whatever schooling the day requires of them, entirely unaware, most of them, of the particular vigil that concluded only hours before behind these old crooked walls, of the 7 separate sorrows that found, in this small, low-beamed room, exactly the warmth and company they most needed, on a foggy November night when the rest of the sleeping town could offer them nothing at all. In the small back room, Hester Allenby sleeps deeply and dreamlessly, the particular honest exhaustion of a long night's faithful work finally permitting her body the rest it has earned. The narrow cot, beneath its quilt of small stitched wrens, holds her gently through the morning hours, the pale November light moving slowly across the room as the sun continues its climb toward midday, marking the quiet passage of hours that belong, for this brief interval, entirely to her own rest. She does not dream, this particular morning, of Samuel, nor of the cold November night 15 years ago that took him from her, nor of any of the particular sorrows that passed through her door across the long vigil just concluded. She dreams instead, in the formless, peaceful manner of truly restful sleep, of nothing in particular at all, simply the deep, undisturbed quiet of a body and mind that have, for some hours, set down every burden they have carried, and rest now in the simple, sufficient comfort of having done good and faithful work, and having earned, by that work, the right to this particular peace. Outside, beyond the small window, the robin continues its persistent morning song, and somewhere further off, the bell of St. Mary's marks the passing hours with its familiar, comforting regularity, and the town of Rye goes about its ordinary daylight business, entirely unaware that one of its quietest and most faithful guardians sleeps just now, the deep and well-earned rest of a long vigil properly and thoroughly completed. The lamp in the window, extinguished now against the morning light, waits in its accustomed place, ready to be relit when evening comes again, as it has been relit every evening for 15 years, as it will be relit, Hester intends, for as many years still ahead of her as her strength and her devotion to Samuel's memory permit her to continue this particular faithful vigil. For now, though, there is only sleep, deep, peaceful, well-earned sleep, and the small quiet house on the steepest street of an old crooked town, resting at last beneath the pale gold light of a clean November morning, the promise of its open door and its burning lamp held safe and steady, waiting patiently for whatever the coming night might yet require of it.